Hi there, Sammy here. You join me on a beautiful autumn afternoon today in the village of Warton in Lancashire, and because I have a very interesting building to show you today, which illustrates wonderfully the difference between the qualitative and the quantitative aspects by which a building can be considered, which demonstrates the potentially enormous difference that can exist between the two, and which we can use to talk about the value of a building from a couple of different standpoints. So let me show you where I am. This here behind me is Warton Old Rectory. It's an early 14th century building associated with the church, which you can see poking up behind it, which of course has been rebuilt variously over the years. And it's probably not even fair to call this a building properly. It's a ruin now. As you can see, there's no roof. There's very little left in the way of walls. Very little of it left. You can see some Gothic arches, some thick walls. We'll go for a little walk around, and while I show you the spaces that are left inside, we can have a think about how this functions as a building quantitatively, and how it functions as a building qualitatively, and indeed whether it actually functions as a building at all in either of those two senses. So, welcome to the Great Hall. You can see perhaps the most immediately striking and impressive part of the building still standing is this gable end with its rather distinctive window set high up in the elevation. You can see at various points around the building, particularly if I come through to the two smaller rooms at the end, which are left either side of a central passageway, or what would have been a central passageway. You can see other features such as this row of joist holes behind me over that window lintel, which again are on the other side. You can see that this would have been a two-story section. You can see the remains of a fireplace up there. Now, why this building is interesting for me is that if you consider it according to a set of parameters that are quantitative, and by which you might use to assess the value of a building, it does come up rather light. Not having a roof, not having a proper floor, not having any thermal enclosure, it performs so poorly as a building that it's almost not even right to think of it as a building. But if you look at it instead in terms of the heritage value of it, then clearly it's quite significant. And what is that heritage value? Well, clearly it's mainly historic value and architectural value, particularly historic value. For something this ancient, 600-700 years old, there is a value that you can't replicate. There's no way of achieving that with a new build. So what we have here is something that cannot be built, cannot be replicated. It can only be accrued over time, and it connects us to the past across time in its fabric, in its remains, in what we can know and imagine about it. Which means a key part of the appeal of this space, this building, is what it can do for your imagination. Now, this building has interpretation boards around it that tell a little bit about its history, and it has some maps, some plans with it that show what's left in the context of how it would have been when it was more complete a few centuries ago. And all of this is designed to tell a story, and that's designed to capture the imagination of a visitor. And so the imaginative power, the demonstrative power, the illustrative power of a place like this is in showing us how life was in the past, where we come from. I mean, that's not something that should be neglected at all. It's about connecting people to the past through time, through heritage. I particularly like the term heritage because it's not just about history, and it's not just about the physical remains of a building. It's about how people connect place across time, and that's really my key interest professionally and in research I've done. There are some external spaces here too as well, which I'll show you now. Relatively little of it left, unfortunately, as you can see. Some of it on different levels. It looks as though a watercourse actually ran under where I'm standing. And one of the important things you have to remember, and I think this is where an example like this is particularly interesting, not just as a way of thinking about new design, but a way of thinking about storytelling involving the built environment, which is, after all, the setting, context and vessel for all of our experiences and interactions, really, and which shape our societies, is in the way this functioned. And I don't just mean how one room related to another necessarily, how the layout functioned, but what the purpose of this building actually was, how it contributed to Warton, the village, in the medieval period, how it served a political function, how it facilitated meetings, how it was a representation of power. Considering a building in all of these terms means considering it in terms of all of the perhaps overlays, is a good way of thinking about it. All of the ways that a building can have value that go beyond the mere obvious bricks and mortar, the nuts and bolts, the masonry itself. Oh, there's a little alcove here. I wonder what that was for. It almost looks slightly ecclesiastical. This would have been the great hall I was standing in, as I mentioned, and there are so many ghosts of things that have gone here. It's not just a case, I don't know if you can see that, on the side there, the row of archways carries on. There's half of another archway on the end, which has clearly been filled in at some point by a reconfiguration. That in itself, in fact, conveys the impression of ancientness almost more effectively than simply being what it is, an old stone ruin, because changes like that take a very long time to accrue. If you're an architecture student, you'll be very familiar with the word palimpsest. I like to play architecture student bingo sometimes, which involves interacting with architecture students and seeing how many times they use words like palimpsest or liminal or dialectical, because they do come up surprisingly frequently, but with good reason. Because when you look at the innate qualities of a place like this, you have to face the fact that it is a collage of many different experiences over a very long period of time, which collectively constitute some kind of culture, and that's why it's cultural heritage, and how it connects to us over that very long period of time. But as a building, as somewhere to live and use, clearly it's completely unsuitable. So when thinking about new design, or thinking about creative placemaking of the sort that might be done if you're creating a video game project, for example, or doing some graphic art, is think about how a building tells a story. It doesn't just have to be a question of what's the floor-to-floor distance, what are the number of lumens in a given space, does it meet building regs, can you afford the building materials. All of that stuff is important, but there's a whole nother world, and that is to do with how it's used, how it's understood, how it becomes a thing of value over a long period of time, what its legacy ultimately will be. Alright, that's all for now. See you soon.